Ex-millionaires of Reddit. What made you lose all your money? My great-grandparents owned a luxury fur coat business and made an enormous amount of money. When my grandmother and her brother, my great-uncle, moved out of their parents' house, they were each given a substantial sum, not millions, but far more than the average person might receive to start their adult lives. My great-uncle ended up opening two businesses with his share of the money, a gas station and a used car lot. He did quite well running both. We'll come back to him a little later in the story. My grandmother, on the other hand, spent much of her money on fancy clothes, vacations, and other luxuries. She later married my grandfather and had 3 children. Eventually, he cheated on her and took a large portion of what remained of her money in the divorce. Meanwhile, my great-uncle continued expanding his ventures, starting a payphone business, helicopter tours, and several other enterprises. By then, he was doing extremely well financially. Sometime later, my great-grandparents passed away within a few months of each other. Their inheritance was divided in 2 parts. 1/3 went to my great-uncle, and 2/3 to my grandmother. The reasoning was that he was a wealthy bachelor with no children, while she was struggling to make ends meet as a secretary raising 3 kids on her own. This really ticked off my great-uncle, since he knew exactly how she had handled her previous windfall. He was angry that the inheritance hadn't been split 50-50, though it wasn't enough to make him stop speaking to my grandmother, at least not yet. So what do you think my grandmother did with her massive inheritance? Did she open a business? No. Did she invest it? Not a chance. Did she do anything even remotely productive? Of course not. The first thing she did was quit her job. Then she bought a big house in a nice neighborhood. After that came the luxury car, designer clothes for my mom, aunt, and uncle, and a full-time live-in maid. Soon it was vacations to all the trendiest destinations, gourmet meals every day, and every toy or gadget they could dream of. You name it, she bought it. So it should come as no surprise that she burned through the entire inheritance in less than a year. 2/3 of the money her parents had worked their whole lives for, an amount most people couldn't even dream of spending, was gone in under 12 months. But she didn't stop there. She kept spending, sinking herself deep into debt. They lost the house, the luxury car, and eventually had to sell their designer clothes and expensive toys just to cover what they owed. Then she showed up at my great-uncle's office asking for more money. She was promptly escorted out by security and told that he would never speak to her again, and he never did. Imagine my surprise growing up on the edge of poverty, only to be told that my family used to be filthy, stinkin' rich. Because of what my grandmother did, my great-uncle completely cut off contact with her side of the family for years. I didn't even meet him until I was a teenager. I think later in his life, he started to feel guilty about punishing the rest of us for something that was entirely her fault, so he began reaching out every now and then. Still, none of us ever felt comfortable asking him for anything, even though we were all struggling. When my grandmother was on her deathbed, she begged us to ask my great-uncle to come to the hospital so she could apologize. When he was told about it, his response was basically, "I don't give a crap." And then, in an almost poetic twist of irony, he went on to marry an obvious gold digger about 30 years younger than him, who had already outlived 2 other wealthy older husbands. When he died, she inherited everything, disconnected the phone line, and vanished like a bandit. His actual family got nothing. Story 2. Not me, but my great-grandfather started a candy company that served most of the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. My grandfather and his son eventually sold the company for over $100 million, though my mother and I aren't entirely sure of the exact amount. He used the money to buy land in Florida, franchise a few Radio Shacks, and purchase a lot of cars. During this time, he divorced my grandmother and married another woman who already had children. Toward the end of his life, he reconnected with my mother and met me, but then he developed brain cancer. He decided to cut his wife, the one he was essentially disinheriting, out of his will and leave all of his remaining assets, still around $10 million, to my mother and her brother. Because he was bedridden, he had to have his lawyer email and print the new will for him to sign and mail back. He asked his wife to send it to the lawyer, but for some reason, it got lost. He died a few days later, with my mother unaware that the will change had never been finalized. She ended up paying for the funeral, only to learn afterward from her lawyer that the will had never been legally updated. When she tried to confront her stepmother, she discovered that her stepmother and her sons had already flown to Florida, taken the money, and disappeared. My mother attempted to sue for a few years, but state laws and the lack of written evidence prevented the case from moving forward. That's how she lost a multi-million-dollar inheritance and was left responsible for a $50,000 funeral bill. Story 3. Not me, but my brother-in-law. He made about $4 million in the late 1990s and early 2000s through a piece of the Beanie Babies craze and other items in the gift industry. Today, in 2020, he lives off the income from a small commercial property he owns and Social Security. He spent most of his money, roughly 25%, on travel and electronics like giant TVs and computers, and the rest on rock art. This included a framed copy of Sgt. Pepper's signed by all 4 Beatles, which he claimed was rare because all 4 signatures were done with the same pen, proving they were in the same room at the same time. He also had a Hofner bass signed by Paul McCartney and a host of other so-called signed memorabilia. Here's the kicker. It was all fake. Every single item. He spent almost $2 million on forged rock art. The dealer he bought from in Hawaii had been sued multiple times for forging provenance. When my brother-in-law finally tried to sue, the attorneys came back and told him there was nothing to recover because the dealer had no money. Story 4. My dad had over $20 million in a business with 12 locations and 3 more on the way. Then an employee caught selling drugs fabricated a story claiming he got the drugs from my dad's company, saying the whole business was a front for the Mexican cartels. Because my dad had spent time in Mexico and had a prior criminal record, that was enough for the DEA to act. Over 300 SWAT agents raided every single location and my dad's home on the same day. They seized computers, terrorized employees, and left his young children traumatized, even though he wasn't there. Over 300 SWAT agents raided every location and my dad's home on the same day. They seized computers, terrorized employees, and left his young children traumatized, even though he wasn't there. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. All papers were in order. No indictments came, no case. Regardless, most of the employees and management quit due to the investigation. He had to close most locations and sell the business after less than a year at a huge loss just to pay for lawyers defending the case. The worst part? The authorities won't admit they found nothing. The DA spent millions on the raid and left the case open indefinitely, making it impossible for him to work in his field. His lawyers told him the prosecution has privately asked him seriously to find something to plead to so they can save face. He won't lie, so they won't close the case. The government took my dad's life's work, his savings, and ruined hundreds of other people's lives, and we have zero recourse. Story 5. I come from a very poor background. When I was a child, my parents filed a lawsuit after I became deaf due to a medical misdiagnosis, and we won. The money was placed in a trust that I couldn't access until I turned 18. By court order, my parents weren't allowed to touch it because of my dad's felony record. However, they took advantage of a loophole that allowed my mom to write to the trust fund guardian to request money for things like school clothes, supplies, and gifts. Mainly my dad, would pawn off most of those gifts anyway. Eventually, they manipulated the guardian into letting them buy a car so they could take me to school, medical appointments, and judo classes at the YWCA. They sold the car not long after. That's when I learned never to trust anyone. I also never had the chance to learn how to manage money or understand just how real financial risks can be. When I turned 18, my dad, who had a degree in business but had never managed to start one, asked to borrow money from me. I assumed it was because we'd always been poor and that this was finally his chance to make something work. He promised to pay me back double, and with how confident and logical he sounded, I agreed. He borrowed $150,000. A few months later, I grew frustrated when it became clear he wasn't doing a single thing to actually start the business. Around that time, his 30-year-old van broke down beyond repair. It would have cost more to fix than it was worth. I was pressured into buying them a new van. Apparently, giving my dad my bank card was a huge mistake, because with all the extras and upgrades, that van ended up costing $80,000. What the heck? I fell into depression again and didn't want to deal with anything. My dad thought it would be a good idea for me to give him power of attorney, and he explained that it would allow him to handle my financial responsibilities for me. I didn't want to meet with my financial advisor to discuss stocks or investments, so I agreed. What I didn't realize was that this gave him full control over my money. To fight back, I started spending before he could, buying a Toyota Supra and other expensive stuff. It was impulsive and immature, but at the time it felt like the only way to take control. I ended up overpaying for the cars and everything else, so when I tried to resell them, I only got back about 50 to 75% of what I'd spent. That made me feel like I'd already lost, like the money was never really meant for me. After that, I kept spending motorcycles, quads, and more until all I had left was about $200,000. I wasn't a millionaire anymore. I thought I couldn't make anything of the money I had because I lacked knowledge, standards, and the advantages that successful families seem to have. I didn't know I could buy a house. I didn't know I could purchase a thriving restaurant, keep the same staff, and earn my investment back within a few years. I didn't realize I still had enough money to grow it into something much bigger. So instead, I just lived off it, and I didn't work. I got into a relationship and, once again, was used for my money. Yep. Now that I'm older and living in extreme poverty, I regret so many things, especially knowing what I know now. I'm certain that if I ever have money again, I'll handle it wisely and never be manipulated like that again. The hardest part is just getting started. Every time I try, I'm haunted by my past and end up stopping myself. So, I haven't worked. It makes me angrier every time I think about it. Maybe one day, that anger will finally be enough to push me past the block and into success. I have so many business ideas, so many, but I need money to start, and that's the most depressing part. Story 6. I was almost a millionaire. Oh boy, here we go. A few years ago, I met my significant other when AMD and Tesla stocks were dirt cheap, before Tesla merged with SolarCity. At the time, I was making pretty good money, but living like a homeless person. My spending was minimal. I drove a crappy car and I put 90% of my income into AMD and Tesla stocks. The thing is, I knew nothing about stocks. I was just curious about investing. So basically, all my money, literally all of it, was tied up in stocks. Then I met my significant other, and suddenly I needed better clothes, a nicer car, money for movie tickets, and other everyday things. At that time, my paycheck went directly to Schwab, and I lived off the 10% that went into my credit union. Like I said, I was borderline homeless. I was working as a garbage man, and my paychecks were actually pretty good, but I needed cash fast. So, I sold all my stocks at a minimal profit, about double my investment, and spent it all. Apartment, BMW M3, dress clothes, an insane number of dress shoes, and even small necessities like razor blades. Everything. That stock money didn't last long. Looking back, I should have just adjusted my deposit percentages, 10% to Schwab and 90% to my credit union, since I needed cash fast. Suffice it to say, today I could have been worth many millions. Now, I'm worth basically nothing. I'm a father now, a family man, and a landlord. Just kidding. Well, I am a landlord, but a good one. Mostly, I made the mistake of renting to family. They don't pay rent, so my main income goes straight to covering mortgages, leaving me with nothing until the courts sort it out. Money isn't a huge issue at home, but I no longer have the surplus to invest in stocks like I used to. I kick myself constantly for being so young and naive. I keep thinking, if only I'd had a father figure to guide me. I do have a father, but he's a moron who abandoned us as kids to chase his own pursuits. There's light at the end of the tunnel though. I'm not worth much. Actually, I'm not worth anything. But I do max out my $400,000 every year, and that's something I'm proud of. It's not easy, but I stick with it. I don't have the discipline or patience for the stock market anymore, so I just put $20 a week into Schwab stock slices. It's a fun little way to gamble, buy, and hold. I also own a few income properties that I'm hoping will finally turn a profit once my tenants start paying rent again. So, there's that. I was almost a millionaire, my friends. Funny to think about it now. And I don't blame my wife, by the way. It was my fault for saving every penny and living so frugally that I neglected basic things like a decent wardrobe or proper possessions. When I met her, I suddenly needed everything. I left my Schwab account open and recently logged in after the crash in March. That's when I decided to double down on my $401,000 and get back into the stock game. I'm a buy and hold kind of guy. But man, I should have just readjusted my deposits and I'd probably be swimming in money right now. Who knows? Maybe I'm just meant to be a slave to the dollar. Screw it. Story 7. My dad, not me, made some really shrewd stock market investments after he retired. He focused on options for an oil refiner during a time when the US was facing a real shortage. He had done extensive research and studied the situation carefully. His strategy paid off and he got rich, maybe to the tune of $2 million. At that point, he could have been set for life. My dad was already incredibly smart. He had a PhD in mathematics and was a highly respected professional dating back to the 1960s. But he thought his early success meant he could take even bigger risks. He bought a lot of newer options in the same company. I suggested he diversify, putting a portion into something more conservative, like an annuity, to ensure steady income forever. I told him if he did that, he'd always be rich. He didn't follow that advice, and now he's far from where he could have been. I haven't said anything to him since he lost it all. I did what I could at the time to save him from himself, but there's only so much anyone can do. It pains me to see how it played out. He did so many things right in life. He deserved better. But in securities investing, there's no such thing as deserve. Morals of this story. 1. You aren't an investment genius after your first blockbuster win. You need a track record. Story 8. My grandfather was a thrifty man, always a DIY type. He hated hiring contractors, except for my father, whom he introduced to my mother. He worked nearly 40 years at our local GM plant. Over the years, his savings, cash deposits, and investments built him a net worth of about $2 to $3 million. After walking off the job at GM following a scuffle with management, he started his own business. At 64, he became a landscaper and evergreen farmer, securing government contracts with county and local agencies, which brought in another sizable chunk of money. Her sister's husband did essentially the same thing. And this is where my aunt comes in. Let's call her Karen. Karen wormed her way into my great-aunt's life. As my great-aunt neared her 80s, she became frail, and Karen took care of her. In reality, this meant she had my great-aunt sign over power of attorney and immediately transferred everything to herself. Brand new house, all 3 cars, RV. She then placed my great-aunt in a convalescent home where she passed away. The will had been officially amended so that anything not already taken by Karen would go to her as well. My other great-aunt died suddenly and left my mother as executor of her modest will, which mainly included the items in her house since she was in the process of selling it. I was very young, but I remember Mom loading me and my 2 brothers into the car and racing down the highway to beat Karen to the house before anything could go missing. We were successful. Mom was able to inventory and distribute everything properly. Among the items we ended up with, of all things, were her turn-of-the-century pasta crank and a big box of recipes. By this point, Grandpa had developed cancer and had slowed down his business. Now 75, he owned a nice, modest house on a piece of extremely valuable land, thanks to explosive development in the area. Mom took time off work to help Grandma care for him until he passed away, leaving everything to Grandma. After that, we moved into Grandma's house to help her around the home and assist with closing and liquidating the business assets. After about a year, Karen wormed her way in like a tick, and things started disappearing. Farm equipment and other valuables went missing. Her daughter's husband even went into the storage barn and destroyed many family heirlooms, including furniture from our home. Most of these items ended up in a fire pit behind the barn. It wasn't long before Karen convinced Grandma to let her handle her finances, and then she evicted us. Within 2 years, Karen and her family sold the family home and land, liquidated all of Grandpa's stocks and bonds, and fled to Florida. Once again, Karen gained power of attorney and legally seized all of Grandma's remaining assets. Grandma died tragically after being given an insulin shot 20 times her prescribed dose, sending her into diabetic ketoacidosis. She passed away slowly and painfully, ultimately succumbing to brain death. Out of an estimated $4 million inheritance, Mom and her 2 sisters were given an equal share of $12,000 each. Karen kept the house and the cars and eventually burned through everything. Unsurprisingly, this shattered the family, and now none of us speak to each other. Story 9. My dad is an ex-millionaire. He's a genius when it comes to starting successful businesses, a real wizard at it. But his problem is that he can't let them go. He's the kind of boss who refuses to hire anyone outside the family because he doesn't trust anyone else to run things. He drove $3 million companies into the ground because he couldn't keep up with his own success and wouldn't let anyone help him manage it. Story 10. I have a relative who became a self-made millionaire many times over. He was the hardest working person I've ever known. Right after graduating from high school, he got his real estate license and quickly became a successful realtor. Over the next 30 years, he expanded into a construction company, opened a store selling kitchen cabinets, and accumulated over 20 rental properties. But it wasn't enough for him. He began renting out some of his properties to people who would pay him to grow marijuana. His granite business was even used to transport the product across state lines. Now, he's in jail facing a minimum of 10 years, and the government is going after all of his rentals and assets. Story 11. Not me, but my high school best friend Sip's family. A little backstory. Let's call her A. In the 1980s and 1990s, A's dad, who is the brother of a fairly well-known musician, decided to leverage his connections in the music industry to start a concert tour. He would bring bands and musicians to our country to perform in 5 cities. He brought over artists that most people here could only dream of seeing live. The venture was a huge success for many years. A was the rich kid in primary school. Her parties were always amazing. She had the best toys and the biggest house. Coming from an upper-middle-class family, I got to go on vacations at our beach house, but we rarely traveled internationally, maybe once every 4 or 5 years. A went overseas twice a year. When I was 9, her dad even gave my parents and me Golden Circle tickets to see UB40 live, which was an incredible experience. Around our final year of primary school, we must have been about 12. I went to visit A, but my mom dropped me off at a different house. She explained that I would still see A, but she now lived in a new place. The house was still fairly large, but old and unattractive. It didn't have a pool, whereas their old house had 2 pools and multiple hot tubs. I asked her why they moved, and she said it was because her dad thought people weren't going to his concerts anymore. She added that it was temporary. He was bringing a big band from overseas, and then they could have a nice house and luxurious holidays again. That year, they came to stay with us at our beach house for the festive season. It was nice spending that time with her because shortly after, our friendship would fizzle out. We started high school together, and life was fairly normal, but A didn't hang out with us much or invite us to stay over. Eventually, her parents moved her to a public school because they could no longer afford to keep her and her brother at our school. Years later, when I asked my mom what had happened with A and her family, she explained that A's dad had started getting fewer and fewer attendees at his concerts. Partly it was because he was stuck in a dream world, bringing over acts he personally enjoyed rather than what was trending at the time. Partly it was because he didn't really know how to run concerts. He overpaid for the acts and undercharged at the bar, losing hundreds of thousands over the years. Eventually, he had a big plan to bring over a major band again, but he didn't have the money to put together one final concert. He wanted to borrow from my dad, but my parents couldn't risk it, knowing they might never get the money back. Today, I still see A from time to time. She seems like a very sweet woman, but she is just like her dad. She has never held down a steady job, aside from waitressing here and there, and she is always busy trying to promote events and small parties she hosts, expecting us to attend. I really hope her luck turns and that she finds her path soon. Story 12. Not a millionaire, but by 19, I had managed to save about $170,000 through hard work, determination, and a massive stroke of luck with the kindest employer I've ever had. After seeing all that money, I made a series of frivolous financial decisions, and one smart one that ended up being my saving grace through COVID. I bought a car in cash, paid 6 months of a townhouse rental in cash, and proceeded to smoke weed, getting caught multiple times in a state where it wasn't legal. Most of my money went to treatment classes, drug testing, court fees and fines, and 2 lawyers. I'd estimate that smoking pot in a conservative state ended up costing me roughly $50,000, including the cost of the pot itself. The rest went toward a Roth IRA, 2 cars, 3 motorcycles, and 3 hospital visits. I was lucky enough to recoup some of what I'd lost through a great job opportunity, but unfortunately it didn't last due to COVID. I was laid off before I'd worked there long enough to qualify for unemployment or severance, leaving me forced to dip into my savings to support my family. While I was working for my last employer, I decided to take out a loan for my dream car. 2 weeks later, I was laid off, so a large portion of my IRA has been going toward that loan. I'm now facing the prospect of either selling the car or letting it be repossessed. Luckily, I've paid enough on it, with help from my family, that I can sell it for more than what I owe, so I'm not completely screwed. But next month is likely to involve a lot of fasting and ketchup sandwiches. Any further withdrawals from my IRA would come with heavy penalties, since I've already used up the initial capital investment, so that's no longer an option. It's amazing how quickly a dumb kid can go from saving diligently without fully understanding what I was doing to blowing it all once I realized I had the freedom to spend my earnings however I wanted. It took several years to reach that point, and it's taken even longer to regain a rational mindset and recover from other poor financial decisions. But now I can finally say that every dime I earn goes straight to savings. I no longer use illegal drugs, so there's no risk of fines or court fees derailing my progress anymore. However, I'm aware that the job that allowed me to accumulate my initial funds was a one-in-a-million opportunity, which I blew. It's hard to settle for anything less than what I earned before. It's soul-sucking to see people offering $10 or $15 per hour, if we're lucky, when it's obvious they could afford to pay more. That's something I wish would change. Everyone deserves the opportunity to earn more than the bare minimum just to survive. From my perspective, not everyone gets that chance. I'd say not even half the population of this country gets that chance. Story 13. My first husband was making $1 million a year. He lived life to the fullest, spending frivolously, but earning enough that it didn't matter. We divorced amicably. No alimony, no child support. He just paid for whatever the kids needed. Then he was diagnosed with leukemia. He fought like hell for 3 years. The last 2 years were incredibly expensive, but it was worth it. Money won't make you happy, but the lack of it can destroy you. The kids and I take comfort in knowing that, in the end, there was truly nothing else possible. His millions bought his children 2 more years with their dad, and I'm glad for him that he got to enjoy his life while he could. Story 14. I built a business worth around $3 million, had a house worth $1.4 million, investments exceeding $2 million, and 4 nice cars. Then came divorce. An ex-wife, a lawyer, and a judge stripped me of at least 3/4 of it. I was left with a Miata race car, a bit of money, and 51% of my company still on the hook for alimony. I gave up. I negotiated my way out of alimony by giving up more of the company, liquidated everything else, bought a boat, and sailed away. 26 months later, I came back and started over. I've earned enough now to live a modest retirement, and that's where I am today. Lesson: don't get married, boys. It's not worth it. I've done it twice. The first time was a disaster, the second an annoyance. That's just my opinion and experience. I'm way too drunk to post this normally, but there it is. Story 15. I wasn't a millionaire when this happened, but had it not, I would be by now. I'm talking about divorce. I'm in my 50s now and have been divorced for over 14 years. Way back in the early 90s, when my then wife and I were in our early to mid-20s, we were watching the news in our city. At that time, there were 11 major auto plants in and around the city. Not anymore. The news crew went inside one of the plants and spoke with workers on the assembly lines in their early 40s. Many of them were millionaires on paper through their 401k accounts, having started right out of high school at 18. Guess what my wife and I did after that? Yep, we signed up for 401k accounts. They were better in the 90s. The US economy was strong, and companies would match contributions up to a certain amount. So we got everything we put in, plus an equal match from the company, and of course, it was all invested. Not long before turning 40, we divorced. As a result, any funds contributed to a 401k account during the marriage were considered marital property and subject to division, unless there was a valid prenuptial agreement. I lost a significant portion of my accounts. At one point, I had 3 different 401k accounts. I eventually consolidated to 2, and then I also opened an IRA. I've been maintaining 2 401k accounts for quite a while now. Again, I never did reach millionaire status on paper through my 401k accounts, but the divorce certainly knocked me down a peg. In the 14+ years since my divorce, my 401k accounts have grown significantly, but I'm still not a millionaire on paper through them. Had we not divorced, I would be a millionaire on paper through my 401k accounts by now. Losing half of those accounts after nearly 20 years of contributions really hurt. I'm not fully back to where I was at the time of the divorce, but I still have over a decade to continue working and adding to my accounts. I may or may not reach $1 million in my retirement accounts by the time I retire, but I certainly would have if we had stayed married. Story 16. Not me, my mom. My grandfather died and left everything to my mom. Later, my father passed away and left everything to her as well. Mom always thought she was a smart gambler. She won something like $25 in the lottery once and went out to buy a car, proof, in her mind, that she could beat the system. That was the start of it. While Dad was alive, he kept her gambling under control. After he passed, Mom found a boyfriend, a former bookie and professional gambler. They frequently went to Indian casinos, where they eventually squandered every penny and then some. My sister told me that after selling the big house for another $500,000 and buying a small condo, Mom took out a $50,000 home improvement loan against the condo. No improvements were ever made. Casinos, lottery tickets, a cool $1 or $2 million, gone. Story 17. This is about my ex's mom, not me. She grew up a trust fund kid in a tremendously wealthy Jewish family in New York. When she turned 18, she decided to see the world, moving to Israel, then Iraq, then France. For 30 years, she lived extravagantly, burning through her money as if it were unlimited. But, of course, trust funds are finite. Eventually, she found herself with just enough to return to the US and buy a tiny house. By then, her family had long since disowned her, so she had to find work. Only problem: no prior work experience, no credentials beyond high school, and she was 48 years old. Her first job, housekeeping at a local Best Western, until she was fired for rocking the boat. Within her first couple of months, she proposed a series of expensive changes that offered little benefit beyond "I think it would look nice." Next job, driving a short bus for senior citizens. That ended disastrously when she turned the wrong way down a one-way street, panicked at the oncoming traffic, and crashed straight into a fire hydrant. She then fled the scene, abandoning the company vehicle and several now injured passengers. Story 18. In my parents' basement, somewhere on one of my old laptops or external hard drives, is my old Bitcoin wallet. Back in March of 2010, my WoW guild started tipping each other Bitcoins for silly things. I joined in, buying around $16 worth just for fun. For context, Bitcoins were about 0.003 cents per coin at the time. I quit raiding in May of 2010, and somewhere in all my old drives, the wallet is still sitting there. The problem is, I can't figure out which drive, which folder, or even what system it's on. I've spent weeks digging through my old hardware with no luck. About 2 years ago, I was in my parents' basement while visiting with my wife and kids. That's where all my old systems were in storage. My mom casually mentioned that she had thrown away some of my computer stuff because, apparently, who needs 4 laptops and 3 desktops just sitting around? I'm fairly certain she tossed them. I can't really confront her about it. It would just make her mad at me for not securing my data better. I mean, I'm sorry. I honestly thought you wouldn't randomly shove my stuff into a closet in the basement of your decent-sized house that you never actually check. It's only around 74 million, give or take, that I can't find. Each time I go down there now, my dad is aware, though I'm not sure he really believes me, but he's told my mom not to touch my stuff again. I spend an hour or two digging through a different hard drive or system, hoping I might still find it. I doubt I ever will, but who knows. Story 19. My dad owned, or rather inherited, my grandfather's Pontiac dealership. He was a math and economics wizard from Duke, but still lost it all. The first recession in the early 90s hit hard. He tried to diversify, selling boats and other items. The dealership sat on prime real estate, and he sublet to a body shop and a few other businesses, but unlike other dealers, he didn't branch into other car brands. My grandfather had experimented with Subarus, but the early models were terrible. Fast forward, Pontiacs were dying, and for a variety of reasons, my dad sold the dealership. This is when he truly broke into the millionaire club. He didn't sell the property though, and the rent from it was huge. He continued working at other dealerships, but the business was rife with moral degradation. My dad was an honest salesman, yet he cheated on my mom, messy all around. Fast forward, he spent heavily supporting 2 families, covering illnesses, college expenses, and so on, but the rent and his ongoing work kept him afloat. The final blow came from 2 so-called friends who stabbed him in the back. The first got my dad involved in a shady real estate deal. Trusting him because he was a friend, my dad failed to properly vet it and ended up losing perhaps half of his fortune, money that was never recovered. The second friend had made his fortune thanks to my grandfather, who hired him and taught him the car business. Eventually, he owned his own dealership, and my dad even worked for him. This friend also rented my dad's old dealership property to expand his business, and my dad offered him favorable terms, but the friend wanted ownership of the property. My dad refused, valuing the steady rental income. The friend sued him twice, ultimately winning a breach of contract case due to a poorly written sublet agreement. Dad received a sizable payout when he sold the property. It wasn't what it would have fetched on the open market under ideal conditions, but it kept him a millionaire for a little while longer. Eventually, though, he died penniless. We all wondered if he had hidden some of the money somewhere. He wasn't dumb, but nothing ever turned up. My stepmother is completely unhinged, and we can't even get into his house to collect mementos. Story 20. I have a rich uncle whose father owned a large chain of gas stations and some oil fields in Turkey. When his father passed and he took over, he didn't give a damn about the businesses. He just partied and squandered everything. He would buy a new luxury car nearly every week, get new boats, move into a new luxury home every few months, and furnish it entirely with new stuff, throwing the old furniture away. After a few years, it all collapsed, and he had to sell everything to a large U.S. corporation when he hit insolvency. Everyone in the family hates him now, though, to be fair, he's always been entitled and self-centered. But here's the kicker. Despite being an unproductive, reckless loser, he managed to marry a bank director. She's extremely wealthy and continues to fund his extravagant lifestyle. Basically, he's living as her sugar baby. It's baffling. How can someone go broke owning oil fields? Every time we visit family in Turkey, driving from Istanbul to our hometown, we pass around 20 gas stations that used to bear our family's name. It's a constant, ironic reminder of what used to be. Story 21. This is my mother's family story. Back during the partition of India and Pakistan, my mother's family was extremely wealthy in what is now Pakistan, mansions, maids, thriving businesses, and a solid reputation. But due to the socio-political unrest between Hindus and Muslims, they had to leave everything behind and move to India. Her grandfather stayed behind temporarily, disguised as a Muslim to wrap up financial affairs. He had to remain undercover for 3 months because being identified as a Hindu could have cost him his life. The family had no contact with him. They could only hope he survived. Although he had to let go of much of their wealth, he managed to smuggle a number of solid gold bricks to India to give the family a fresh start. He first went to Bombay and handed the bricks to a goldsmith, asking him to coat them in silver for safety during travel. Silver was less risky and cheaper than gold at the time. When he finally reached his destination and gave the bricks to another goldsmith to remove the silver coating and evaluate their value, it turned out the gold had been swapped for solid silver bricks. Story 22. My mom is an ex-millionaire. She once had a big house, a Mercedes, and a country club membership. She inherited money from oil royalties when my grandfather passed, and she didn't work. She just spent. She's an alcoholic, and the money fueled that habit. She received checks every month, thinking they would never stop. When the payments dipped, she temporarily curtailed spending, only to splurge again when they went back up, assuming the highs would last forever. Each downturn cost her everything she had accumulated during the boom periods. She ended up with a mountain of credit card debt and blew through my college fund, my brother's college fund, and my niece's college fund. My dad had bought me property in Florida and put it in my mom's name, intending for it to be transferred to me when I turned 18. Instead, she sold it and spent the proceeds. Eventually, the money completely stopped. She either sold the rights outright or spent every last dollar, and it dried up entirely. She now works for $12 an hour at a call center and lives rent-free with my sister. She looked for better-paying jobs, but having been out of the workforce for more than 20 years, it was difficult. I can't judge her too harshly. I'm not perfect with money myself. It stings a bit seeing how my sister was supported at my age. My mom bought her a house and paid for her schooling when she was in her 20s, giving her a significant head start. That contrast can be frustrating sometimes. Story 23. After college, we moved from the USA to Lebanon to be close to my husband's family. Unfortunately, both of his parents passed away before we arrived, his father a few months prior to our move, and his mother during our flight. She was buried just hours before we landed. It was not a good omen. Still, we had brought every last possession with us and were determined to make it work. Over the next 30 years, we built a life. We acquired several houses and apartments, held good jobs with benefits, and amassed pensions. The early years were tough. We truly starved at first, but eventually we were able to look forward to a modest retirement and the freedom to live where we wanted, whether in the USA or Lebanon. All of that was wiped away due to the country's economic collapse, worsened by COVID but primarily driven by financial mismanagement and corruption on a scale almost unparalleled in modern history. Now, everyone in Lebanon is looking to emigrate. There are no renters with money to occupy our apartments, the lira has collapsed, and our pensions are nearly worthless. Looking back, we could have spent those decades in the US, building 401ks and buying a home instead of watching years of careful planning disappear overnight. Story 24. I funded a business for a friend of over 10 years, only for him to quit midway, leaving me stranded in a foreign country with over $15,000 in unpaid debt. On top of that, I lost nearly all of my life savings, around $90,000 in Bitcoin from 2014. He still insists we parted amicably. This experience reinforced a harsh truth. Most people in general can be complete assholes and narcissists. They downplay their own wrongs, exaggerate your mistakes, and twist the narrative until it becomes almost unrecognizable fiction. When it comes to money, trust but always verify. I had invested in another business where the CEO was later identified as a scammer. He fled from UK authorities but was eventually caught. Before his capture, he had scammed a well-known exchange at the time, MintPal, and stole millions in user funds, myself losing over 30 BTC. He is in jail now, not for the fraud, but for convictions of rape involving 12 or more women. The Crown Prosecution Service dropped all fraud cases due to insufficient evidence, leaving him unaccountable for the financial losses he caused, including mine. Once he's released, he could potentially have millions or even billions of cryptocurrency as a personal retirement fund. Story 25. Not me, but the father-in-law of my mother. When the man was young, he worked as an assistant in a printing business. He learned everything he could about the trade, and one day he won a moderately large sum in the lottery. He used the money to start his own printing business and married a woman who seemed more interested in his wealth than in him. They had 5 children regardless. The business did well, securing major contracts, and for a time the money kept flowing. The story of his life became one of luxury cars, grand houses, exclusive clubs, and extramarital affairs. He would visit the parks in his hometown, hand out money to children, buy them ice cream, or enter a bar or restaurant and pay for everyone. Each child had a dedicated maid, and virtually every chore in every house was handled by staff. He paid for their schooling and eventually their university tuition. Yet he didn't trust his children to run the business, he thought his sons weren't smart enough, and he refused to let a woman manage it. He eventually decided to sell the business and live off the proceeds, a risky choice from the start. Things worsened when he got divorced, and his ex-wife took half of his money. Many years later, in their 70s, they reunited because she had spent all her own money on who knows what. They lived off his remaining funds, but his lifelong spending habits soon made the money scarce. Now, he lives on rent assistance. His accounts have gone to zero this year, and he is showing signs of senility. His children are unlikely to inherit much, as he had sold everything to maintain his lifestyle. Story 26. Not me, but my late grandfather. He was a Navy doctor and served as the chief medical officer at the Okinawa base in Japan following the Korean War. After leaving the military, he opened his own private practice in the Hudson Valley and performed high-risk surgeries at local hospitals. He was the wealthiest person in his suburban town, and he and my grandmother, a minister at the local church, were respected community leaders. They oversaw racial and religious integration in the area. Grandpa, who was Jewish, even convinced the town council that black neighbors would not drive down housing prices. At his peak, his wealth was around $3.5 million. He gradually lost much of it raising 3 children, all of whom pursued higher education. My uncle and aunt both became lawyers, one holding a double doctorate in law and psychology, the other with a master's in law, while my mother became a teacher with a master's in education. All of this was funded by Grandpa. While he didn't die penniless, he was no longer the wealthy local mogul he had been in the 1960s and 70s. His legacy, however, lived on in his children's accomplishments and the community he helped shape. Story 27. I guess my family. My grandparents were great investors, but you'd never have guessed it because they lived very simply, no flashy cars or other extravagant items. The only sign of their wealth was an empty lot across the street with beach access. That beach was a huge part of my parents', my cousins', and my own childhood. So many memories tied to it. After my grandma passed away, my grandpa remarried a few years later to a woman with very expensive tastes. Think $10,000 to $30,000 cruises. He was usually able to keep her spending in check, and to her credit, she helped him stay active for 25 more years, which was worth more than the money. But after my grandpa passed, she blew through all of it. Cruises, jewelry, a new sports car, and more. 2 to 3 years later, she was broke and had to sell the properties, including our family beach and all the childhood memories tied to it. Story 28. This is more about my dad than me. He worked in telecom in the 1980s, eventually rising to VP level in an international company. His team developed a part of communication platforms that's nearly obsolete now, but during its peak in the late 1990s and early 2000s, he received huge salary increases and stock options as bonuses. He could take smaller cash sums or larger stock options. He ended up with hundreds of thousands in company stock options and had also made some smart personal investments. Life was good. My mom wanted comfort, so we went on lavish vacations, bought new cars, wore fancy clothes, and fully built out our house. Then the dot-com bubble hit. His company had been backdating stock options and committing serious fraud. The entire executive team fled to a Middle Eastern country with no extradition treaty. Stocks were frozen at about $200 a share, and when they were finally unfrozen 11 years later, they were worth $9 a share. On top of that, he had invested heavily in a pharmaceutical company that ultimately failed, losing everything. As a result, his retirement is ruined, my college fund was wiped out, and he'll have to work for some time to recover. Story 29. Both sides of my family came from wealthy backgrounds. On my dad's side, his father lost his own dad when he was only 40 days old. He was the youngest of 7 children, and his mother never worked or managed money. When her husband died, he left her a substantial fortune, but she had no clue how to handle it. She asked her brother for help, but he was a gambler and lost all the money. My grandfather spent his life in relative misery as a result. On my mom's side, her mother was also born into a rich family, 1 boy and 4 girls, one of whom had died before her parents. Her parents owned 2 villas. The main house went to the son and his family, and the other larger house just a few blocks away went to the 3 daughters, all of whom had married wealthy men and didn't need it. Here's where it got complicated. My grandma was divorcing her husband, who had lied about being wealthy but was actually penniless. To support her 2 daughters, my mom and my aunt, she had to sell her share of the villa. She and her sisters agreed to sell the house and divide the proceeds 3 ways. This allowed my grandma to educate her daughters and provide for them, but she herself lived a life of modesty. Story 30. My grandparents came from a noble, aristocratic line. After World War I, their titles were revoked, but they still had wealth, which they invested heavily in real estate. When they passed away, their 3 sons inherited everything. One son became a famous DJ and is probably much wealthier now than he was before. Another lives a quiet family life, supported by the inheritance in a way that suits his lifestyle. The 3rd son, the oldest, my father, always loved the high-class luxury life. He lived like a millionaire, even though he was deeply in debt. When the inheritance came, it was a godsend for him, and he quickly spent it all. When that wasn't enough to cover his debts and lavish lifestyle, he sold nearly all the inherited assets, original paintings, luxury clothes, centuries-old jewelry, and most of the real estate, keeping only his massive apartment. Now, his dream is to sail the world. Recently, he told me he won't be able to afford it unless he sells his apartment. That's when it really hit me just how much of the inheritance he squandered and how unlikely it is that I'll inherit anything at all. It secretly made me quite angry, not because of the money, but because I've lost the chance to hold on to family memories. Generations of jewelry, artwork, and other heirlooms are gone forever, sold without ever asking me if I even wanted any of it. I was only lucky enough to recover the noble family seal ring, and that wasn't through him. Story 31. Obligatory not me, but a very close friend. He became an orphan at 15, but was left a substantial inheritance he couldn't access until he turned 18. Once he did, there was really no stopping him. Despite his financial manager begging him not to, he would regularly withdraw large chunks of money around $100K at a time and spend it on basically whatever he wanted. He collected vintage cameras, mostly Leicas and Hasselblads, and had an unhealthy fascination with strip clubs. At the time, we were best friends, living together in a youth hostel. I knew about the money, but I never asked him for specifics. I wouldn't let him buy me things, though I did go along for a couple of those strip club visits, not gonna lie. As these things go, the money quickly dried up, and by the time we were around 20, he was basically flat broke. A few years ago, he moved to another country and is now attending university. Before he left, he revealed some of his wildest purchases. Two that really stood out were a Cessna airplane, which he would hire a pilot to fly him around in, and a house in Spain that he bought on a whim without ever seeing it. We weren't even from the same continent. All in all, it was a fun and chaotic time for both of us. I think we've both moved forward with a better understanding of money and just how quickly it can disappear. Story 32. My dad is like a discount Donald Trump without the personality. He was left a business, some capital, and a decent chunk of land, not multi-millions, but a solid head start. In my 40 years on this earth, he has squandered it all and ended up in debt. He has the Trump mindset of, if you aren't screwing someone, you're the one getting screwed, which leads him to make the worst possible business decisions. If he thinks he has someone's pants down, he jumps in on the deal no matter how dubious it is. If he thinks someone is taking advantage, he pulls out entirely. More often than not, he ends up with 100% of nothing rather than 60% of something. People know this. They offer him deals that will dodge taxes, avoid regulations, or cost him nothing while leaving them safe. He buys the last house on an estate for less than cost, the car on the forecourt that will lose the dealer money. It's such a shockingly self-destructive mindset, and he hasn't learned a single lesson from it. Story 33. Both my father and my brother are ex-millionaires, and both made their fortunes in sales. I only discovered in my 40s that my family used to be extremely wealthy. Back in the early 1970s, my father was named in the will of a close friend who happened to be rich. At the time, he was in real estate, and his company did very well selling property in Florida. The inheritance pushed his wealth into the millions. Then the oil crisis hit, and he lost it all. Instead of consolidating or protecting his remaining assets, he kept throwing good money after bad, trying to recover. I was only 2 at the time, so I had no knowledge of any of this. As far as I knew, we never had much, so it was a huge surprise to learn that we had once lived in Florida only for a few months. My mother hated it and missed Canada, and even owned a Ponderosa restaurant. My brother followed a similar path. Decades later, he earned his millions selling HVAC systems. But when the market tanked, he did the same as my father. Rather than saving or investing, he kept pouring money into trying to recapture his previous success. Story 34. My dad owned, or inherited, my grandfather's Pontiac dealership. He was a math and economics wizard from Duke, but even he couldn't escape bad luck. The first recession in the early 1990s hit hard. He tried to diversify by selling boats and other things. The dealership sat on massive prime real estate, and he sublet parts of it to a body shop and a few other tenants. Unlike other dealers, he didn't branch into other brands. My grandfather had tried Subarus, but the first generations were awful. Fast forward, Pontiacs are dying, and for many reasons, my dad sells the dealership. This is where he breaks into the millionaire club. He didn't sell the property though, and the rental income was huge. He continued working at other dealerships, but the industry was full of people with questionable morals. My dad was an honest salesman, but he cheated on my mom, so it was messy. Over the years, he spent a lot supporting 2 families, covering illnesses and paying for college. The rent and his work propped him up, but the nail in the coffin came from 2 friends stabbing him in the back. One got my dad into a shady real estate deal he didn't properly vet because it was his friend, and he ended up losing probably half of his fortune, money that was never recovered. The second friend had made his fortune because my grandfather had hired him and taught him how to sell cars. Eventually, he had his own dealership, and my dad even worked for him. This friend was also renting my dad's old dealership as a way to expand his own business, and my dad gave him a favorable deal. But this friend wanted to own the property outright. My dad never wanted to sell, since it provided steady income. The friend sued him twice and finally won a breach of contract case due to a poorly written agreement related to a sublet of the property. My dad eventually got a big payout for selling the property. It wasn't the open market value he could have gotten under ideal conditions, but it kept him a millionaire a little longer. Ultimately, though, he died penniless. We all wondered if maybe he had hidden the money somewhere. He wasn't dumb, but nothing ever surfaced. To make matters worse, my stepmother is unstable, and we can't even get into his house to retrieve mementos. Story 35. Not exactly a millionaire story, but I had my own financial disaster in Vegas. I went on a week-long holiday with my brother, his friends, and my own friends. Beforehand, I had saved up $50,000 for things I wanted to buy and experiences I wanted to have. By the third night, we got into gambling, and I lost $20,000 right off the bat, leaving me with $30,000. I remember saying, "Yeah, screw that, never doing that again." That, of course, didn't last long. On the fifth night, I lost another $10,000, leaving me with $20,000. My brother felt bad and gave me $150 as a consolation. The sixth night came, our last night, and I was feeling confident after watching all these videos on gambling strategies. At the club, I lost $5,000 immediately. No big deal, I thought. I still had $15,000. I bought drinks, got drunk, gambled more, and lost $10,000, down to $5,000. I stormed out, roaming the streets to cool off, promising myself I wouldn't gamble again. 5 minutes later, I was back at it. Lost the remaining $5,000. I went back to the hotel, broke, frustrated, and humiliated. Looking back, I've actually learned how to gamble strategically and protect my money, but back then, I had no clue how to manage my own cash for my life. Story 36. Both sides of my family were millionaires back when it really meant something. My grandfathers were successful in very different ways. One had a ton of investment properties and was an extremely successful architect, while the other was a high-powered lawyer. Grandpa one trusted a swindler who ran off with a huge chunk of his money through a bogus deal for a major real estate project. Fortunately, he had diversified, so he wasn't ruined, but he was never as rich as he once was. My grandma had enough to live very comfortably and still die with over $1 million, but it just wasn't the same scale of wealth. Grandpa, too, was your classic criminal lawyer jackass. He divorced my Nana, who was also a piece of work, and to ensure the family got nothing, he hid all his assets with his nephew, my father's cousin. True to form, the cousin betrayed him, tried to have him committed, and kept the money. Grandpa, too, ended up dying alone in an apartment with a leased luxury car and 3 grand pianos. Story 37. Not me, but my uncle won the lottery twice. The first time was before I was born. News spread quickly, and as a man with many acquaintances, people lined up outside his house for weeks. He bought the newest car at the time, but he never invested or ran a business. Unfortunately, the car got into an accident, costing him a lot in repairs and damages, and within 6 months he was back to being poor. 4 years later, he got lucky again and hit the mega lotto. This time, he tried to be more careful, but he still didn't know how to manage the money. Within days, he was scammed by a friend offering a business venture. On top of that, he had impregnated a woman he was having an affair with, who then blackmailed him for money to keep it from my aunt. He even bought a house for her while his original family continued living in the same old house. 20 years later, my uncle lives like a beggar. He often comes to our home asking for food, but he wasn't close with my mom. Both of his 2 wives haven't bothered to check up on him. Story 38. I work in telecommunications. I was an executive at a large mobile phone company. I got fired and divorced at the same time, so I was in a tough spot. I had $3,000 per month in alimony and child support payments, plus a $3,000 per month mortgage. My ex drained all the money from our bank accounts and even took another investment property we owned. It was in her name, but I had paid for it. I did receive a payout from the company, but that money went quickly when you're burning through $8,000 to $9,000 a month at minimum. At that point, I took a couple of pretty big risks. I assisted a private equity company with a takeover of a large firm and performed some financial maneuvering, which worked out well for them, and they paid me handsomely. I also sold my house, the only asset I had kept from the marriage, and bought a couple of apartment buildings in my girlfriend's hometown. Then I began traveling the world, consulting for other companies that wanted to replicate what the private equity firm had done. This generated enough capital to turn one of the apartment buildings into a hotel and restaurant complex, entirely debt-free. The property's income increased from around $30,000 per year to $150,000 per year. We just bought a new house here in the town where we have our investments. Our businesses do about $600,000 in turnover and roughly $300,000 in profit. We have a small debt on the house, and that's it. I'm now buying a 3rd apartment building and figure I can rinse and repeat every 2 to 3 years indefinitely. I'm not sure there are broad lessons here. One thing is that I happened to get lucky and work on something unique that people all over the world are willing to pay good money for. Obviously, that path isn't available to everyone, but I would suggest to anyone that it's a good idea to become extremely skilled in one specific area and be well known for it. A second, possibly useful lesson is not to get too sentimental about your house. Selling it was extremely painful, but it made all the difference in the long run. I went from a negative $3,000 per month in cash flow from the property to a positive $2,000 per month after accounting for apartment building rent minus our family rent. I never would have been able to execute the rest of the plan without making that move. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.